I'm very easy about these things too, so no need to have that. Okay, keep going. Okay, good evening, folks. Welcome. I'm Nathan Wise. I'm Acting Associate Dean Teaching and Learning, usually in history. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of these lands, the Anaiwan people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to invite you, if you're joining us online, to post in the chat where you're coming from. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Acting DVC, Mike Wilmore. This series, the Russel Ward Annual Lecture Series, was originally conceived to honour the memory and legacy of one of the UNE's and indeed Australia's most renowned scholars of history, Russel Ward. Ward presented the first Russel Ward lecture in 1986, and every year since, we historians have invited special guests to come and talk on themes around Ward's impact and legacy, the nature of academia, changes to historical practice and inquiry, among other things. This year, we have the pleasure of hearing from one of Australia's most dynamic historians, Dr. Peter Hobbins. Dr. Hobbins leads the curatorial library and publications team at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Sydney. He's chair of the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and the ACT, and a councillor of the Royal Australian Historical Society. He has worked as a medical writer, advertising copywriter, academic historian, heritage consultant and museum curator, and he is an ardent advocate for public history. He has published broadly, particularly in the field of medical and scientific and biological history, including 2 books, Venomous Encounters, Snakes, Vivisection and Scientific Medicine in Colonial Australia, and with Dr. Ursula Frederick and Anne Clark, Stories from the Sandstone, Quarantine Inscriptions from Australia's Immigrant Past. His expertise in medical and quarantine history, including the impact of the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic in Australia, has put him in a very good intellectual place to contrast those events with the recent COVID pandemic. Today, he joins us to share some of that knowledge and reflect on the nature of history and the challenges and opportunities that we face in a paper titled Message in a Bottle, Sharing Our Passion for the Past. Folks, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Hobbins. Well, thanks, Nathan. I feel like I should come out with the finger guns now after that introduction. Look, I'd also like to acknowledge the Anaiwan people on whose country we meet. And I'd particularly like to shout out to Callum Clayton Dixon, who in his master's thesis wrote about the extraordinary resilience of the Anaiwan people here in New England. And Matt and I were both, Matt Allen and I were both on the Premier's History Awards panel that actually selected that book as the winner in 2020 in the Regional and Community History Awards. And so I learned a great deal from the scholarship that comes out of this university. I'd also like to thank Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Mike Wilmore, as well as my friend Matt Allen. Nathan, thank you as well. And also particularly Louise, thank you for the very charming and personal welcome to the Armidale Folk Museum today as well. I really appreciated getting a behind the scenes tour, the warts and all maybe, but also it was very personable, and thank you. I really felt very welcome here in Armidale. But of course, it's a genuine honour to be here to present in honour of one of Australia's preeminent historians, Professor Russel Ward. Let me just activate my slides. Okay. It did work before, so I'm sure we'll find it again. There we go. All right. I am a historian, but I work in a museum, which makes me also a trainee curator, an ersatz archaeologist, and an L-plate librarian as well. But what links all of those activities, whether they're a bit amateurish or more informed, is that I love stuff from the past, and I've written and spoken elsewhere about what I call the informal archives, the sort of things that you find on eBay or in op shops. And yes, I did pop into the Armidale Vinnies today. Council pickups, all sorts of places where material from the past can be gathered in and out of formal collections. Because I love getting to that material. I'm really open to different sorts of primary sources, whether it's a destroyer, like we have in our museum, or down to a postcard.
And what I'm showing you here is the kind of the crusty back end of our museum, what we call the interim receipt store. And this is where materials that are being assessed for the National Maritime Collection are held, either things that we buy or things that are being donated to us. You can see in the picture there, it includes ship models, clothing, paintings, personal papers, all sorts of artifacts, including old scuba diving gear and the odd bit of junk as well. So we have plenty of fun in our IR store, as we call it. Now, there's about 160,000 items in the National Maritime Collection, and there's about 100 that we're currently assessing at the moment. Some of them already have a sort of sense of inbuilt historicity, and I think this is a classic one here. So Percy Kelsey, who you can see there on the left, was a mariner in the 1930s, and he put that message in the middle in a bottle in 1936. He threw it overboard from the Adelaide Steamship Company's motor vessel Malera, and it was found 15 years later in June 1951 in Robe, South Australia. And you can see on the right there the letter that explains how it was found, and there's a news story. In fact, we might just minimise. You can see, it was a little news story at the time. But ironically enough, the finder, Walter Fletcher, couldn't make any sense of Percy's letter because he couldn't read or write. So, even though we think these artifacts from the past are a way into understanding different worlds, they're not always as easy to get to as we might think. Similarly, for instance, there are many objects from the past that are inscrutable in their own ways. And what I'm showing you here is a flaperon that was found on Reunion Island in 2015. I had a chance to stand next to this piece of aircraft wreckage when I visited the Australian Transport Safety Bureau in Canberra about 5 years ago. Turns out it's from a Boeing 777 airliner, and a little bit of further research proved that it was from Malaysian Airlines flight MH370, which, as we may recall, disappeared in 2014. So like any artifact from the past, it bears traces of its origin, which is how we know it was from that flight. It has a patina of age. It has damage, obviously with its collision with the ocean. And then there are clues to its provenance. So if you have a look over at the top end over here, you can see there are small mollusks that are attached to it that help actually pin down the journey that it had since it impacted with the water in 2014. And of course, all of that evidence about this artifact both constrains the stories we can tell about it, but also creates possibilities, potential histories about the ongoing mystery around the disappearance of that flight. And of course, it's piecing together stories from that sort of evidence that's what drive us as historians. And you're going to ask me now, what do you mean by historian? Well, I am glad you asked, because my definition of a historian is someone who uses materials from the past to explain what it was like. I keep it really simple because it's inclusive, it's generous, and it gives us a chance to bring people into the community of historians. Now, that can be dangerous too, because my definition could include the air safety investigators from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, archaeologists, paleontologists, which is why I get to put our little promo image in here, even climate scientists who use Antarctic ice cores could all be considered historians under my very broad definition. So if I have to be pinned down a little bit more, then I guess I would say that what sets us apart as historians is our desire to narrate the past in pursuit of a sense of historical empathy with the people who lived through it. And that's certainly why I'm fascinated by medical, technological, and maritime tragedies, partly because they help me integrate an understanding of previous environments, technologies and artifacts, and human stories. And I try to piece together a cogent narrative around all of those elements and make an argument about them. In other words, I try to explain what it was like in the past. And you can already build that sense of pathos out of a single image like this one, which is a photograph of the German light cruiser SMS Emden, which was pounded into submission by the guns of the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney on the 9th of November, 1914. On that same day, Russel Ward was born in Adelaide. Nice segue from being a maritime historian, right? Now, over his long and productive life, Russel Ward was a Methodist, a communist, and a humanist. He served his country as a school teacher, as a soldier, and a scholar, particularly here at the University of New England, where he taught from 1957 until 1979. And in preparing for this lecture, I've listened to Russel Ward. I've gone back and listened to some of the interviews and oral histories he did. And for a start, we actually sound pretty similar. We've actually got very similar voices. But more to the point, I was really impressed by Ward's insistence that the historian's lived experience should really inform their own sense of historical empathy. In other words, what we've done helps us think about what other people did and why they did it in the past. And it also, I think, helped him come to a mature appreciation of the way we tell our histories as well. And that comes through when you read his work. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be old and crusty like me to write good history, but I think it's an acknowledgement that all of us come from a place, what other scholars might call situated knowledges. You know, Ward was already doing that in the 1950s and 60s, well ahead of the theoretical innovations that came through feminism in the 1980s and 1990s. I've also been particularly taken by the diversity and adaptability of Ward's approach. And part of what I love about his work is that in the late 60s and early 70s, when he was around my age, mid-50s, he contributed to this series of books and vinyl records that were out in the marketplace. You know, they were sold out there as a way of broadening our view of history, reaching a new audience, but also broadening our view of history, because Ward really believed that the music, literature, art, and folklore of a particular time were central to its culture, and we needed to access all of these in order to understand its own milieu. And Ward, I think, used all those sources to listen for the truth in stories. Even if he couldn't pin down the empirical evidence, he looked for that truth, and he was looking for history outside of the archives, as well as stuff that you could pin down to a document. In other words, I think Ward was always open to histories that were rooted in communities. So my own approach to history attempts to embrace that sort of spirit of generosity as well. And to give you an example, on the 11th of March 2020, I was a guest with James Valentine on Talkback Radio. That was the day that COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. And I was there as someone who had some expertise in historical pandemics to tell it like it really was, pretty much as they told me. But what I loved about that episode was not what I had to say, it was what the callers had to say when they rang in. And one of them was named Judith. And she was really proud of her grandmother, whose name was Beatrice Lake, who, as Judith said in this quote that I've got up there, her grandmother was known as the Angel of Petersham, a suburb in Sydney, because in the middle of the influenza pandemic of 1919, she'd gone out and helped the community, scrubbed things, bought groceries, helped out people who were either sick or caring for the sick or otherwise couldn't get to assistance at the same time. Now, I did go out and look for empirical sources, newspapers, council reports, spoke to the local historian, spoke to the local council archivist. Nobody could find any evidence about this Angel of Petersham. But to me, that doesn't dismiss the story. It's clearly been embodied in that family history for a century. And if I was able to track down Judith, I only ever had her first name, but if I was able to track her down, I would, I'm sure, find some sources to verify that. But what I loved about her story was that an event that was a century ago, as she said, is just part of her life. It's part of that intergenerational identity that stayed in place in Petersham since 1919. Now, I also roamed the streets of Petersham in 2020 as we went into the early stages of lockdown. It was just a suburb away from where I live. And like many of us, I think I appreciated pretty early on, March and April 2020, that there was an extraordinary sense of historicity. This was something unprecedented for us, for many of us, at least in our lifetimes. And I was thinking about how can we document that? And I'll come back to that later in the presentation. But as a historian, I also had this sense that my moment had arrived. I love public history. I love getting history out there, exciting people about the past. And over 2020, I was part of 75 media stories, radio, podcasts, print, and television stories. And I was ready for it because I'd wanted to get history out there. I also had expertise in historical pandemics, vaccination, and quarantine as well. And like any historian, of course, I wanted to be able to explain the process of change over time. But I also had to think about, well, what's my focus going to be? And it came down to this. When you go into a media story, you don't want to be too ambushed, and you should have your own agenda or what you want to communicate, like any good politician. And my story was about the strength of communities in 1919, like the volunteers you can see here in Kensington, another Sydney suburb in that year. And going into that pandemic that we've all just lived through, I wasn't prescient. I hadn't predicted it was going to happen necessarily, but it actually, my expertise came out of a sort of a side project while I was doing postdoctoral research on aviation accidents, which was why I was interested in MH370. But a project that I'd been interested in or had been pursuing was an attempt to both explore and encourage community histories of the 1919 influenza pandemic. And part of that was writing a story for The Conversation, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a website where academics put their research out into the wider world, and it often gets picked up by media outlets as well. And certainly the focus of my story that I wrote in early 2019 was very much about encouraging that sense of historical empathy with people who'd lived through and contributed to caring for others during an unprecedented event. And that story itself had a decent uptake in 2019, but as you can see here, it had another blip in 2020 as our pandemic hit as well. And it was because I'd published in The Conversation. It's a real go-to site for the media. And as soon as they went into The Conversation and searched pandemic, boom, my name came up. Oh, can you tell us what it was like in the past? Of course I can, love to. So part of that was, I was pretty chuffed to be part of the Australian Story episode about the flu pandemic of 1919. The night it went out, it had 1 million viewers. It's on YouTube now. It's had 2.3 million viewers since then as well. And I mean, for that sort of impact for a history story is phenomenal. They did a fantastic job. They went over and above with that story. So it just shows that history can really excite people if we tell the stories right and if we find the right partners to do it. But back in 2018, when I was getting motivated about this side project I was doing, I actually wanted to tell a much more intimate story. And my inspiration was this exhibition. It was put on by the Inner West Council, again, around near where I live in Sydney. It was conducted in the Petersham Town Hall. I'm not going to keep referring to Petersham, but there was a bit of a link in there. And it was put on by the local archivist who brought out council archives, the local historian, and the local studies librarian. And what they basically said was, hey, here's all the stuff held at a local council level. Why don't you, as members of the local population, come in, have a look, and see what stories you might tell? And it was that spirit of generosity and all these records I'd never thought to look at that really got me going with that project. And the thing that fascinated me the most is this color, sort of multicolour document in the front, which was a map of the local area with the 1919 suburb boundaries laid on it. And the local historian had just taken a black pin and put it in the map where every household that had been infected with influenza lived at that time. And the engagement of such a simple intervention was extraordinary. People would come around and go, oh, there's my street, there's my house, whatever. And then they'd say, but what about over there? Why aren't there any pins in there? And we'd have all these great conversations. Well, maybe that's where all the factories were. They weren't households because it was a manufacturing district, or it was near the railway line. And then I would be, they'd be asking questions. Is it around the church or the pub or whatever? So simple interventions like that can have amazing impacts in public history. And they actually loaned it to me and I took it on the road with me around New South Wales. I'll come back to that in a minute. So that very low-tech, intimate inspiration fed into a project that I was part of that was funded by the Australian Historical Association, the University of Sydney and the Royal Australian Historical Society, where we ran a statewide project that launched in 2018 and ran into 2019. We called it an intimate pandemic, I guess for reasons hopefully I've just made clear. But what we were primarily doing was trying to get out and encourage people to create their own local histories of what had happened in 1919. And it really was a focus on community history. What happened in your family? What happened in the local community? What happened regionally? And we wanted to work with local, family and special interest historical societies because it was an opportunity for us to learn from our partner practitioners in the community and for them to share their expertise, whatever their level of formal learning. Now, we did need some sort of core behind that project as well. So part of what I had to do was write about a 5,000 word footnoted article, typical sort of historical prose, I guess. But I did really try to pin it down to lots of local examples right around New South Wales. So we launched that website in 2019, but we made sure we had some resources in there, a research guide to encourage people to poke around the records, as well as an outlet for community historians to share their research in one place, whether they wanted to send in 2 paragraphs reminiscing about their grandfather's stories of Spanish flu, or whether they'd written a 10-page article that they wanted to put out there. We edited it, and we checked it a little bit, but we really wanted to give them a venue where all of their work was valued and shared as a sort of what we basically called a patchwork history of the impact of the pandemic on New South Wales in 1919. Now, the initial uptake was reasonable in 2019, but you can see it was absolutely overwhelmed by 2020. And if we look right over on the right of the slide there, you can see we're still getting little spikes of interest in that history project. It was all about how communities dealt with it. It's not my essay they're going for, I'm sure. It's those community stories. It's validating how history is still relevant 100 years on in local communities and in family histories. And also the research I did for this helped inform the presentation I gave when I was very generously invited to come and speak here at Summeray's Homestead in 1919. Thank you, Nathan, for that wonderful seminar that you put on here about the legacies of 1919. So that was part of that same project, and it was great to bring New England into that statewide project. The focus of our project, though, was about collaboration across disciplines and across locations as well. And I was inspired on Twitter by a group of historians who use this hashtag historians collaborate, including some great colleagues. Bill Oates, who was such an amazing force here at the Regional Archives, Johnny DeGravio and Anne Hardy at Hunter Living Histories, Tanya Evans, my friend at Macquarie University, Mike Esbester, who's a railway historian at the University of Portsmouth in the UK, and also Hamish Maxwell-Stewart, who I suspect most of you know up here at UNE. What we tried to do was keep it simple. We proposed a common theme, impact of a pandemic, 1 year in one moment in time. We provided some shared resources, including this research guide, which went through the sorts of archives you could look at nationally, statewide, local, even into into things like cemeteries and memorials in your town, as well as an annotated bibliography of sources around the Spanish flu, if you wanted to go down that road as well. Really what we were trying to do, though, was to say to people, you write the history that matters to you and then share it. That was the primary thing. We wanted to encourage people not just to research the past, but to feel confident and comfortable in sharing it more widely and engaging in a conversation that way. So we tried to validate those diverse responses as much as we could. And so even well before I had that call from Judith in 2020, we'd gone out and asked a similar sort of question. We went out to the community and said, what does the flu mean to you? We definitely kept it statewide. I tried to actually keep it out of a Sydney focus. And these were the 3 case studies we tended to do. Bathurst, Bega, Bowral, kind of rolls off the tongue. And we were really emphasising we wanted people to dig into those untapped resources around family history and local collections as well. So we wanted people to dig into their council records, go and visit their cemeteries, look for unexpected monuments in the community, and maybe dig up some of the oral histories that were recorded in the 1970s and 80s, which spoke to old timers then who remembered the flu, because a lot of those hadn't really been rejuvenated since they'd been recorded on TDK D90s. We also said maybe go out and have a look in your secondhand shops as well. That was just an excuse for me to do a bit of op shopping, really. But the other reason we did this was, this is 2019. We'd just come out of 4 years of World War I centenaries, what was sometimes called centenary fatigue. And that was a very masculinist approach. And it was all about the Anzacs and the World War I experience. And what we were trying to do, as you can see in the pictures here, was to say, actually, Australia's experience of 1919 was very evenly shared across the community. And women really came to the forefront there in extraordinary ways. They were empowered in ways that probably hadn't been seen before. And so it really was a bit of a tipping of the scales to think about a different way of thinking about a common event that united Australians after World War I. So the best part for me was I got to go on a roadshow, as we called it, around New South Wales. So the funding that we had was not much, about $5,000, but it allowed me to drive up to Tenterfield, out to Bathurst, down to Albury, up to Dubbo, into Richmond, then up to Stockton. And then I went back and ran a workshop in Sydney, and then also came up here to speak at that seminar. So in other words, I didn't go everywhere, man, but I did at least get to quite a few places. And everywhere we ran those workshops, we did it in conjunction with the local family and historical society. So we actually contacted them first and said, look, would you please help us put on a workshop for your community? I'll come in, do a song and dance, and then we'll actually just sit down and talk about what sources have you got here? What stories do you want to tell? How can we help you do them as well? So it was great fun doing it. And it did mean that I got to also explore some of those local collections. So every town I went to the cemetery and into the op shops. Okay, you're getting a bit of a theme coming here, right? You'd be surprised what turned up in some of the antique stores, for instance, as well. But also when you know you're focused on a particular historic moment, you do see memorials in different ways. And you realize that the local doctor had a monument built to them, partly because they nearly worked themselves to death in 1919. It certainly drove home to me how many of those sources survive in the community, both in a material sense, but also in, you know, the family histories, the rumors, and some of the myths as well that just circulate through the community. Some of them we had to gently debunk, but also we wanted to build in because they're part of a community sense of identity. It did bring home, though, a couple of methodological issues that I'd somewhat anticipated. So in 1919, if you go back and look, there's not a lot of written primary sources. This series of letters are a bit of an exception because, of course, people who were sick, people who were caring for the sick, stopped sending letters the way they did in normal times. Also, the posties got sick and that system broke down as well. Similarly, people who were keeping records for local councils or health services or whatever, those systems, you can actually see the records just stop. Churches, parish councils, schools, the record keeping just stops for about 6 months or 3 to 6 months in 1919. So there's actually a great absence in the written historical record from that period. On the other hand, probably the people who were doing the most to keep records in that period was the local reporter. So this, if you were to pick one year in Australian history when you can rely on newspapers more than any other moment to give you the best possible account of what happened, that's the year I would pick in terms of using historical newspapers, because the reporters were doing the rounds of the doctor's surgery and the hospital and the cemetery and actually talking to people about how they were coping with it while people were busy coping. But when you think about that, an absence of historical records, a predominance of newspaper accounts, and unfortunately, not many communities did go back and look at those oral history recordings, then there's a bit of an imbalance there in the record. But there's also some silent informants we can talk to as well. And of course, I'm thinking here about, again, one of the real strengths of local historians and particularly family historians is their willingness to get out literally in the weeds and go out to the local cemetery and do some recordings of headstones and dig into the stories about that. I mean, it's very rare, as you can see on the left there, that the actual cause of death is included on a headstone, pneumonic influenza. That was the official phrase that was used here in Australia, while the rest of the world tended to call it Spanish influenza. But family historians are tenacious in looking at cemeteries, cemetery records, birth, deaths, and marriages, and then getting through their genealogical sources as well. So this is a really interesting place where I think we can build upon that community research and also get at the level of intimacy, you know, like the daddy written on the footstone here. It really drives home just how intimate that death was. And sadly, I have to say, you know, right now, we are just reaching the point of the same number of deaths from COVID after 2.5 years of the pandemic as Australia experienced in 9 months in 1919. In other words, 15,000 people died in 1919 because of the flu, on top of 60,000 who died over the 4 years of World War I. To put that another way, for 5 years in a row, Australians grieved for 15,000 people who died before their time. And the flu came at the end of that. So that helps inform how we think about monuments like this. It's an enormous process of communal collective mourning. But unlike World War I, we don't see those monuments around the country that we did see to the Australian Imperial Force. But some of that work really inspired community historians, which then, of course, in turn inspired me. So if you look at the Shoalhaven Historical Society, for instance, they did this great little project where they looked at all the deaths from influenza across a century in their local area, from cemetery, from headstones, cemetery records, and the local newspapers as well. And so they published this history that gave us case reports on each of those individual deaths, just to drive home the intimate impact, whether it was in 1910 or in 1950. But they also collated some data. And when I went poking around that, it proves something really interesting. So the blue bars represent every year except 1919. And it shows what you would think of as the normal pattern of influenza. In other words, young kids and people over 60 are those most at risk of dying during a normal seasonal influenza outbreak. But the orange bars show us how different the pattern was in 1919. It was the people, particularly in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, who were dying at a very unexpected rate. And what I love about this, I mean, it's tragic, but it also shows that data that's true at a local level echoes what the pandemic showed worldwide. And we're talking about 50 to 100 million people dying over the 2 years of that pandemic back then, which is 3 to 6 times how many people died throughout all of World War I. And that global scale plays out at the level of something like the Nowra General Cemetery. So we encourage multiple outputs from this program. I certainly don't want to take credit for a lot of these historians were doing this work on their own anyway. But they mounted displays, talks, published articles and books. And I surveyed at the end of 2019 about 30 published accounts of the Spanish flu pandemic. Almost all of them emphasised the importance of local community. And you'd sort of expect that. The local historians using local sources, of course, they're going to come back to that local focus. But I think it also reflects the fact that they were writing history for the places where it was made. In other words, they were writing for their local community. And that, of course, had another impact in 2020 when they were telling those histories again to communities starting to be affected by our pandemic, not the one from a century ago. We did also see some interesting corollaries in the historiography as well. So in New Zealand, which had an even worse time than Australia in New Zealand's experience of the Spanish influenza was much worse than ours was, and it hit earlier in 1918. But in 1988, Geoffrey Rice published a book-length account of that, and it's been republished several times since. It's basically easily available. In Australia, the first full book-length account of Spanish flu here came out in 2020. And what that meant was that through that whole centenary period of 2018 and 2019, there was no single overwhelming story of Australia's experience of the Spanish flu. There was no, to quote Russel Ward, no Australian legend of the Spanish flu's impact. And so that meant that, to me, looking at that survey of community histories meant that they'd all arrived at similar conclusions to what I had, which was that pandemic was managed at a very, very local level, at your street, at your congregation, at your community, at your council level. And they'd all come to that conclusion through looking at those records, just as I had. I have to be fair and say some of my academic colleagues who'd looked at Commonwealth and state government records had reached different conclusions. They thought it was all about bickering between the states and the Commonwealth trying to get power, which is also what we saw in 2020, right? All those things about Commonwealth and quarantine powers, borders shutting. We did see that when you go to the government records, but when you get down into the weeds of local records, you see a different story emerging. I did see some cautionary notes coming out of that as well, though, because that book I showed you, Ian Shaw's one, was written entirely from Trove. He didn't use any other primary sources. And many of the community histories also relied heavily on digitised newspapers in Trove. Now, bearing in mind what I said about the importance of newspapers in 1919, I still think that's worrying for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the easy accessibility and searchability of Trove means that it does push out those attempts to get to those trickier local sources. Like, you're going to go to Trove or you're going to go and visit your local council and say, hey, have you got some archives from 1919? Oh, they're not indexed. Oh, how am I going to find what I'm looking for? So we need to just remind people to go beyond Trove. I'm not dissing it anyway, but we need to go beyond that and remember that there are those local collections and that many risk being lost, not wasted, but just simply not seen because they're not digitized or not as indexed or catalogued as we'd like. But also I'm worried that there's not necessarily any criticism of how the media operated in the past. Most of us today understand that if we see a story on the news or we read it in newspapers, it's not always exactly how it was. You can't always believe everything you read, right? But somehow when people look at Trove, oh yeah, that's what happened in the past. So we just need a little bit more historical literacy around The local reporter and the local newspaper editor were embedded in a local community that had its own politics, its own commercial networks, its own social networks, and perhaps that shaped the stories they published a century ago. It's not a complicated story, but I think it's just one we need to get out there a little bit more. But relying on newspapers alone also runs a risk, for instance, with historical terminology. So I mentioned before the phrase Spanish flu. Now, if you look at the blue dotted line at the bottom of the graph, that's how often the phrase Spanish influenza appears in Australian newspapers after the pandemic for the next 50 odd years. But if you know that in Australia that pandemic was formally termed pneumonic influenza, then have a look at the impact. Far more stories that you're searching for, but also a far longer tail that goes well after the end of the Second World War. So that's sometimes been called the forgotten pandemic. But when you know what phrases to look for because you've done a wider diligence, there are still, still interesting things we can be finding. Now, that influenza pandemic story was really founded on an odd claim that I made, which is that the primary outputs weren't going to be mine. That's not something academic historians are always good at doing, but that was really my focus. I really wanted this to be a collaborative project where the focus was on the community publishing what they did. And it came down to also helping the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park in Sydney mount their 1919 exhibition. They did some really nice stuff around Spanish flu in there. But I felt really proud at the end of 2019, before we'd ever heard of COVID-19, that together we'd actually created this new community history of something other than World War I that was about how Australia responded to a crisis a century earlier. Now, I termed this talk Message in a Bottle, so I should probably come back to that as a bit of a theme. One of the problems I faced as a historian, particularly with an interest in medical history, was vaccination. Now, in 1919, there was a vaccine against pneumonic influenza. About a quarter of the population of New South Wales agreed to be vaccinated with it, but it didn't work. It was a vaccine created against bacteria, and in the 1930s, it was established that actually Spanish flu was caused by a virus. So in other words, a quarter of the population was effectively vaccinated with something that didn't work and potentially had damaging health consequences. That was a tricky thing for me to think about as a historian. How do I tell that story without sounding like an anti-vaxxer, even though I know the reality of the situation? And that was particularly because one of my other secret motivations in running that flu pandemic project was I wanted to encourage history audiences, and let's be honest, many are over 60. I wanted to encourage many of them to actually be immunised against seasonal flu each year because it's easy and it is a risk if you don't go through being vaccinated. So it was an ethical problem I had to face as a historian. And in fact, if I'd stayed in academia instead of going into museums, the next research project I probably would have done was about the history of immunisation and anti-vaccination in Australia, because it brings up all sorts of personal and political issues. And even though I have an honours degree in pharmacology, I am trained as a biomedical scientist way back last century, it's still a dangerous thing to put out there to say, I'd like to ask how often it was right for people to be cautious about vaccination in the past. But that comes back to that issue of historical empathy and to our role as historians of saying people in the past weren't ignorant or benighted. They had reasons for their beliefs. What were they? And I won't go into too much of that detail now, other than to say that people often did have valid reasons for being cautious about being vaccinated 50, 100, 200 years ago. And some of those reasons and some of the strategies they developed became really useful to us in 2020 when we didn't have a vaccine against COVID. And we had to go back to things like mask wearing, social distancing and quarantine. So we can learn from those things even when it's politically dangerous to bring them up. All of these issues, of course, played out again as 2020 rolled in. And I had to rethink, how are we going to capture what's happening around us at that point? By now I'd moved into private industry, so I wasn't working in universities. It became an interesting exercise in how do I respond while I'm not sort of institutionally bound. But I also then had to think, well, how am I going to tell the 1919 story again to an audience that's now far more receptive around the nation? Because that's where my ethics of history started to intersect with these acute concerns about our personal fears, about what was going on in our community and some of the policy decisions that were being made. And pretty early on, it was clear that many of our collecting institutions were trying to rise to the challenge. They were aware of that gap in the records from 1919 and didn't want to see that happening again. So they created a lot of collecting initiatives, arguably too many in 2020, particularly in the digital space. But it was also partly a reaction to the sense in the community of historicity of COVID-19. We all knew something major was happening. We could see drastic changes in our social, financial, and psychological fabric happening all around us. And so suddenly that historicised account of 1919 that I'd been peddling for a year and had been encouraging other people to study became super relevant to what we were living through on a daily basis. One thing I was trying to do through that year was use social media to use the COVID Street Archive hashtag and encourage people to just take photos of what was going on around them. Just grab what you can. My particular interest was in signage that appeared in shop windows and on people's front fences and the semiotics of that, what messages were coming through. And I was really interested particularly in causality. In other words, were they saying that these things were shutting down because of the pandemic, because of their concern about their communities, because of their concern about their own welfare, or because government made them do it? So there were interesting stories evolving there, as well as different ideas about who the community was, who was and wasn't welcome at that time. And it did also help pose a bigger or a meta question, which is, what does our community think history is today? We probably all think of it as a gradual process of change over time, and our role as historians is to explain that process of change. But it seemed to me, looking at what happened in 2020, that broadly the community thinks of history as a series of epistemic ruptures, massive breaks, dramatic changes in the way that Georg Hegel, Thomas Kuhn, and Michel Foucault may have theorized, dramatic changes in the way our world looks. And that's why people around us felt that history was happening in a way that they hadn't thought, say, in 2018 or 2012, possibly in 2001 after 9/11. But how does all of that sense of historicity translate on the ground? Well, I'm a historian who likes to work with archaeologists. I've even got a trowel. Sometimes they let me on sites, generally not. But unlike 1919, our pandemic has produced an abundant material culture. And in fact, one of my favorite archaeologists, the combat archaeologist John Schofield, has argued that COVID-19 has already created a distinct stratum in the archaeological record. And so despite the infamous toilet paper shortages of 2020, I've argued that what happened with all these single-use materials through the pandemic has kind of an orgy of Anthropocene self-preservation. Faced with an environmental crisis and a health crisis, we protected ourselves. Understandable, but we made that ethical choice. I was going to do a little bit of a straw poll in the room. Who amongst you has saved some COVID artifacts like gloves, masks, or rats? Has anybody kept any of that sort of stuff? Okay. 3, yeah, okay, interesting. Time for you out there in Zoom land. And maybe we'll come back to this in the discussion about what sort of archival or historical or narrative sense you think will come out of keeping those artifacts next year, 10 years, 50 years on as well. I'm also going to ask you, if you kept your positive rat test like I did, is that also a biohazard and therefore a different sort of ethical quandary? Sorry? Well, that's what I'm waiting to find out. Mine's still in a Ziploc bag on the fridge and it hasn't faded yet. But really, as a curator, I should be putting it in a darkened space so that we don't have any UV light exposure. All right, last time I'm going to use the message in a bottle theme here, and I'm starting to bring it home now. History ain't always what we think it's going to be. And now in my role as a curator, one of the things that's intriguing me is these hand sanitizer bottles. So again, straw poll, who's still got their hand sanitizer from 2020? Yeah, a lot more of us have kept it. Interesting. Do we think of it as a COVID artifact? Does it help us remember the confusion we had about how COVID spread and the fact that we were worried about hard surfaces and handshakes and whatever in 2020? Or are we actually already thinking this is just a surplus commodity and we'll get through it one day because we want to keep ourselves clean when we get a bit grotty in public? So we might come back to that in the discussion as well. And I guess that's made me think a bit about what else have we washed our hands of already in terms of thinking about our pandemic. I've already spoken about vaccination, but what are some of the ethics of collecting and communicating the mistakes that we've seen in the last few years as well? Certainly my own history focuses a lot on accidents, tragedies, and mistakes or failures in the past. Always write about plane crashes and shipwrecks and pandemics, also snake bite, all sorts of things that are terrifying in their own. But to me, they're a moment in time that highlights bigger issues. But I have to start wondering when historians in the future are going to start unpacking our moment as well. When are they going to look at how our vaccination program rolled out? When are they going to look at how quarantine worked so awesomely until it didn't? And how well we were prepared or not prepared for that to break down rapidly in 2021. I also want us to think a little bit back, remembering 1919, think back about how do we represent those around us today who didn't leave many traces? So again, straw poll, how many of us have kept the app data from 2020 when we were ordering home delivered pizzas? Helped keep us safe at home, right? But somebody had to get out in the rain to deliver pizza contactlessly so that we weren't having to interact with other people. What happened to those people? What happens to the data about what they were doing, the risks they were putting themselves through? Do we have any objects that will help tell the stories of the thousands, tens of thousands of international students who we shamefully sent packing in 2020? How many of the pets that were bought in lockdown in 2020 will be abandoned or put down in the next few years if inflation really takes off and we can't afford to feed them? Who will tell their stories? And I think more than anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has driven home to us that we have to face the fact that we jumped a digital abyss in the mid-1990s. That's 30 years ago. That's the point at which things really stopped being put down on paper on a regular basis. And archives around us are still trying to collect letters and diaries and ephemera from today. But really our epistolary culture, the way we communicate with each other, is almost exclusively digital, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's sending emails, whether it's accessing websites. And we're not really doing a very good job of documenting that. And more to the point, those exchanges are deeply embedded in networks, platforms, devices, and metadata that are constantly shifting around us and probably can never be reassembled again in the future. We need to be thinking about this. We need our future historians to be studying data science and digital preservation as much as they're studying paleography and historiography. And ironically, I think in 2020, many collecting institutions, including my own, the Australian National Maritime Museum, inserted themselves into that space and said, hey, we're collecting COVID. Write to us, tell us your experiences. How has COVID affected you personally? We'd like to share that publicly. It's laudable in one sense, it's like many oral history projects, but on the other hand, it's encouraging a particular sort of performance, and it's inserting cultural institutions into what was previously a private culture. I'm worried that if that becomes the primary record of 2020, then we are potentially twisting the historical record, just as relying on newspapers only to understand 1919 can be as well. It's not to say it's wrong, but we just need to be informed about how we use those sources in the future. But of course, as historians, we're always adept at those challenges. And this is where I loop it back to Russel Ward. So having read some of Russel Ward's work, I'm really impressed at his deft humanism and at his openness to new modes of telling history. So this book here, for instance, came out in 1987 when he was in his mid-70s. It was the final edition. He uses the word genocide to describe what happened to Aboriginal people in Australia. That's 1987. This is a man in his 70s who was an emeritus professor. I think that shows a great deal of intellectual courage on his behalf. But Ward, as I said earlier, also insisted on bringing the historian's life experience back into telling, or back into that sense of historical empathy and the way we narrate our histories. And that to me is why I so much value community history, because we've all got life histories that we can bring to the way we understand and interpret and share the past. And of course, all of us have now lived through our society in extremis. And I think that will help shape the histories that we write. And I'm really curious to see how this book, which will be launched in the next week or two, what that will have to tell us about history today in Australia. And okay, spoiler alert, I do have a chapter in there on community history. So finally, to me, the experience of 2020 in many ways actually reinforced what I felt I knew about Australia because I'd studied 1919. I don't believe history repeats itself, but by golly, I heard quite a lot of echoes a couple of years ago. And that was one of the messages I shared in the media. And if I was to embody one object that to me signifies the COVID-19 pandemic, it's this little cheerful academic Teddy who I saw waving at me from a window as I was walking around my suburb back then. I'd like to think his name is Russell. On that note, thank you, and whatever you do, make it historic.
Thank you very much, Peter. And folks, if you're online, feel free to post a question in the chat and we'll keep an eye on that as well. One just point of clarification, I want to acknowledge John Aitchison, Bill Oates and Peter Hall for their work on the Somers conference that you mentioned. They were the driving force behind that. Any questions, folks? Yeah, Karen.
Oh, it's my role to ask the first question. I'm not sure if I recall correctly, but memory tells me that at the beginning of this session, you said you thought it was strange that there wasn't more commemoration of the victims and heroes of the Spanish influenza or pneumonic influenza than there is. But having said that, your presentation suggests that there has been a lot of interest in it from historians and from the community being brought into it and from families that were affected by it and so forth. But in response to your first comment, I was thinking about it, and I was wondering if one explanation for that is that people get fatigue with things happening over and over again. And we had late 20th century, we had the AIDS pandemic, and then early 21st century, we had SARS and the avian flu and all these other things. And I wonder if, yeah, there's a sense of fatigue about pandemics and talking about it, and maybe they don't want to commemorate it, you know. And then there are also other bad things happening. And because we have, 24/7 media about everything that's happening in the world, people get fatigue from hearing about disasters in general, not just pandemics. So do you think that might be why there's not more interest in commemorating something that happened 100 years ago?
Look, it's a great question. It's really a central question to understanding the memory of that pandemic, the Spanish influenza pandemic. And I just always like to clarify, don't blame the Spanish. It didn't originate in Spain. It's just that Spain during World War I was neutral. They didn't have censorship on their newspapers. When King Alfonso was infected with this influenza that was affecting all of Europe, they reported on it. And so they broke the news and then got blamed ever since. Look, it's one of those things that if you came to the historiography, say 10 years ago, there was a strong story that it was the forgotten pandemic. And I guess part of, I was part of a group who published a book that came out about 6 months ago, rethinking that question. And the case study from Australia, I argued, was that, yes, if you look in Australia in the 1920s and 1930s, every town, every suburb had a monument to those who enlisted and also those who died during World War I. That there was a lot of formal commemoration at a community level for service, sacrifice, and death. But we don't see the same, even though the same number of people died of flu in 1919 as had died on the battlefields in 1918, we didn't have that same level of commemoration. But part of my argument was that it was universal. So people didn't need to have that commemoration or that focus of commemoration because pretty much everyone had lived through it. And it was embodied, literally embodied in their immune system, but it was certainly embodied in their family stories and in their local communities. And it was that sort of lack of forgetting that did come out in the 1980s and 90s when people were being interviewed about their early memories, and that still carried on in family stories as well. So that's part of it. I mean, there's also an argument that whatever you think about Australia's war effort in World War One, you know, there was an extraordinary sacrifice. There was an extraordinary national effort that went into that, and it, you know, the death toll was unparalleled. Whereas in 1919, the story of the pandemic was a little bit about failure of medicine to control the pandemic, failure of governments to adequately manage it, and really controlling that pandemic came down to community groups, church groups, local organisations, and often the local councils as well. And so that urge to formally commemorate wasn't there because, well, do you commemorate a failure? Occasionally we do. You know, we have monuments to the loss of HMAS Sydney 2, sunk by, you know, the German ship Cormorant in 1941. You know, we still commemorate that, even though, you know, there are issues around that. But that's another part of the argument as well. There was no formal memory making around it, but it was never forgotten within the communities where it had its most impact. I guess that's my take on it.
Hamish is online. I think Hamish put his hand up. Hamish, are you there?
I certainly am. Peter, that was terrific, as per usual. I was really interested in what you were saying about family and local. And I wondered whether a case could be made family and local historians actually embrace the digital academic historians have. And do you think academic historians can learn something of what's going on out there in the suburbs? And perhaps do museums and archives have a role to play in coordinating the work that family historians are doing?
I caught most of that. I think you said my presentation was nauseating and appalling, but no, it seemed to me that the question was, can academic historians learn from the methods and the collaborative ethos of community historians? Is that roughly what you said, Hamish?
Yes, it was. Sorry about the echo.
No, that's cool. All right. Yes, I mean, I guess that's kind of the point of my presentation as well. I think we need a spirit of generosity in both directions. I get frustrated at times when academic historians think of community historians as transcribers and data enterers and you know, basically minions. I think, you know, we certainly, if that's how you want to engage with history, that's great. If you want to transcribe cemetery lists or pharmacy registers or whatever, and you enjoy that with shipping lists. Obviously, in the Maritime Museum, we have a lot of people who do like transcribing passenger lists and working out what the spelling of the names are and whatever. If that's how you want to engage with history, that's great. But I think it's a little unfair to treat community historians as simply raw materials or free labour. I've been really inspired by Mike Esbester in the UK. He's a railway historian who's run this enormous project around railway history, where he's worked with people who do transcribe records, but also then ask big questions about, well, how did the safety of railway workers improve over time? You know, was it their efforts? Was it the statistics? Was it public attitudes? Was it a self-help mechanism within the railway companies and unions themselves? And he is always working with that group to create things. You know, obviously, Hamish, I know the wonderful work that's gone on with the Founders and Survivors Project in Tasmania. And again, I think that's another classic one where it's a feedback loop. You know, everyone's in the conversation. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody gets their hands dirty on the historical records. And then we debate it. And yes, you know, you do encourage community historians to read some of the historiography because that helps inform the debate. But equally, it's that lived experience that Ward insisted on that I think is also part of how community historians understand the past and can bring that back into the wider mix as well. So that's probably a bit too short an answer, but I hope that goes part of the way to addressing that. So yeah, definitely that's the sense of community that I would like to see more of.
Can I ask about social media? So a lot of the public discussion around COVID is taking place on Facebook. How do you think historians will document that and talk about that in the future? How do we capture social media?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one because in a sense, I currently, you know, the National Maritime Museum doesn't really collect any social media. So we're now moving into a space where I can say what should happen because I don't have to do it. And that's always dangerous. I did look at a lot of what was going on at other institutions through COVID. I was interested in how our collecting institutions manage that. And it's really problematic in a number of ways. Broadly, we're not capturing social media posts or exchanges. Usually it's sociologists or anthropologists who are looking at those things rather than historians, which is fair enough. They deal in the present, we deal in the past. Archivists deal with it a little bit, but again, most archives are really struggling with digital archiving. And my colleagues at the National Film and Sound Archive are just drowning in the amount of new content that's being generated digitally, let alone adding social media on top of that. So there's a whole institutional change that needs to come through. And it's not just about funding, it's about whole ways of thinking. It's about how do you capture networks and how do you deal with the privacy issues that come out of that as well. So when you look, say, the State Library of New South Wales, who put out one of those Interact With Us, the Diary Files project, they asked for permission to share your stories about COVID. They've also been scraping social media data, but only at a keyword level. They're not keeping tweets and Instagram posts and Facebook posts. They're just looking at what trends come out in the language because they're concerned about the privacy aspects of that. Even though people are putting it out in the world, they're still concerned about that. Obviously, Facebook and many of our internet service providers will have a lot of that data, and we could potentially ask them if we can archive a tranche or a cut across that. That's a bit above my pay grade, but it's the sort of thing I think we should be thinking about. Can we actually ask for a slice of that big data from time to time and park it for a century if we need to? That's what we do with medical records. Wow, I had one other thought in there. Oh, yeah, the other one is the COVID safe apps. Now, if historians in the future want to understand what people actually did through the COVID pandemic, it would be pretty amazing to be able to access who did and didn't agree to be vaccinated, how long it took them to do that, how many courses of vaccination they went through, what COVID apps they signed up for, how often they tracked their movements. Now, all of us would be a bit freaked out if that stuff went into the public domain now. And if you look at the National Archives Administrative Functions Disposal Authority, really boring paperwork, but this is what the National Archives put out to say, this is what we will collect, this is what we won't collect. They said that stuff should be ditched as soon as possible. That COVID safe tracking data and vaccination data should be disposed of as soon as it's not necessary. Now, I would actually like to suggest we shouldn't be so hasty, and that maybe that stuff could be archived and kept with an embargo on it, 50 years, 100 years, 30 years beyond the death of the subject, however we want to embargo it. Again, we raise ethical questions about that, but historians in the future will be thinking in terms of data science and networks and human behavior that we can track through all of those networks. So again, this is a long way from my expertise as, you know, now a maritime historian, former medical historian, but there's some of the fun things that I guess you get to think about being a historian, living through something that everybody knows is a historic event. Oh, cool. All right, let me get my specs back on. Now, I'll just point out that Roland Leichhardt is one of my curators, so it's probably a Dorothy Dix. So Roland's question, for those who can't read it, is, had the last couple of years transformed how we view medical history and therefore medical historians? I have to be careful what I say here. So I left the university system in 2019, which is probably a bad move in a way. But I did find that many medical historians didn't really step up. Many didn't engage with this because historical pandemics weren't their specific expertise. Maybe they specialize in history of psychiatry, for instance, or medieval medicine or something like that. And I was surprised. And so one of the reasons that I started agitating to do that intimate pandemic project was in about 2017, I thought, hey, who's doing the pandemic centenary project? And nobody was. And I thought, oh, I'm supposed to be looking at aircraft accidents, but sure, let's get a little project rolling. And that was really the inspiration. So as as a rule, I think medical historians didn't really step up in a way they could have. And in fact, probably Australian historians more broadly didn't step up in a way that they could have to deal with either the Spanish flu centenary or the emerging crisis of COVID-19 as well. We were really shy, and okay, I'm not shy, and I was prepared. And like I said, it was my moment. I just knew in 2020, if I don't step up now and get some messages out there, I don't think anybody else will. So, I mean, that probably sounds a bit egotistical, but I still remain surprised how much we didn't change that. And I think it was really telling that we weren't really consulted very much about pandemic planning. When you look at pandemic plans before 2020, they did refer to history, and they particularly referred to the Spanish flu pandemic as the worst case scenario. But for instance, I put myself forward on a national database of potential experts to assist with coping with the current pandemic in case they wanted a historical perspective. Guess how many calls I got? So, and again, that maybe that's egotistical, maybe it's not, but there probably weren't that many historians who put their names in there, but a few historians were contacted. So does it change how medical history is viewed? Well, I don't think enrollments in medical history courses have jumped, and I don't know that they will. I think, as we heard before, I think it'll probably be a bit of fatigue now. And so one of my arguments has actually been, let's now park COVID, put it aside for 10 years and then come back and start analysing. So of course I've broken my own rule by talking about it tonight, but I think we're at the point where maybe we do need a bit of critical distance, but I haven't seen it sparking a huge uptake in medical history, speaking more as an outsider who now calls himself more of a maritime historian. The other question was from, thank you, Roland, for that question. Chris Cheng says, he likes my comment about seeking diverse sources of evidence in all the research. It makes sense and is powerful. He'd like me to reflect on, when did you first feel the need to move beyond textual materials, and how has that shaped my thinking and search of new sources since? I'm an op shopper. You probably gathered that. I've always been interested in kind of stuff from the past. So even as I came into history as an adult, I didn't do my PhD until I turned 40. So I came in, like Russel Ward, with a life experience before I started having ambitions of being, calling myself a historian. So I was always open to those sources, but I was mostly a book learning sort of historian up until then. I think what really changed me was from 2013 to 2016, I did a project with archaeologists at Sydney's quarantine station. And that's where I actually got my boots on, got a hat, got out into the field and recorded inscriptions with them. We didn't do any excavation. We didn't have a permit to do that. But I got out and actually got to work with archaeologists, thinking about landscape, thinking about a sense of place, thinking about carvings, thinking about bits of broken glass in the undergrowth, thinking about changing moods and seasons when you engage with a place over time by thinking about its deeper history. And before then, I'd actually been really skeptical about historians who said, oh, you've got to go where it happens. I thought, yeah, military historians always say, got to go and visit the battlefield, sure, whatever. But when you engage with a site and you think about what's on the surface, what's under the surface, and what you think is under the surface but you can't find, that really profoundly changed my ideas of incorporating not only material culture, but landscapes, weather, what we might call affect, those weird sensations you get about places. All of that fed into how I think about history now. So yeah, I guess, again, it's about breaking down boundaries. And I love working with archaeologists. They look kindly upon me sometimes and pat me on the head and say, oh, well, nice try. But I really enjoy working with them because they have a very different approach, but we can actually have those conversations. And I've written a lot of things with archaeologists since, because we complement each other. I love the fact that some historians will say archaeology just confirms what the historical record tells us. An archaeologist like Martin Gibbs will say, actually, no, the archaeological record proves that what was written down was wrong. And that's a great dynamic to play with.
Q Station 2 weeks ago, and your work is prominently on display. It's a beautiful site.
The influenza pandemic that hit the world in sort of 1918-19 had the great misfortune to be immediately following on from the Great War. And obviously, if you contrast your books, and it took 100 years for there to be a book about the Australian Spanish flu pandemic, you contrast that with the untold number of books that were probably written about the war of 1914 to 18. It obviously the Great War just massively overshadowed everything. I mean, it was an orgy of remembrance around that event, and yet an incredible forgetting about the Spanish influenza pandemic that killed vastly more people globally than the Great War did. Is that kind of overlooking of the pandemic, the influenza pandemic? Is that something that's kind of unique to the countries that were so affected by the Great War? And if we go to other countries that weren't so intimately involved in that war, do they have a stronger remembrance of the Spanish influenza pandemic, because it probably by contrast did have a much greater death toll in those countries? So is there a different history to be told if we go to South America, for example, or to Africa?
Look, it's a great question, and it's certainly been asked by a lot of historians in the last 20 or so years. And there's a whole panoply of things that come into answering that. Partly, and I think what we forget and what the last few years have driven home to us, is that 1918, in effect, marks the end of an era. It was almost the blip at the end of, certainly in the Western world, people expecting that if you had a family of 5 or 7 children, several of them would die in childhood. We were talking about this today at the Folk Museum about, a local doctor who delivered 180 babies and none of the mothers died or none of the children died. That's extraordinary in 19th century context. So on the one hand, you have this long history of epidemics and pandemics with no ability to control them, or very limited ability to control them apart from measures like quarantine. And 1918 and 19 comes at the end of that. As most of us would know, World War I was the very first war fought where more people died of combat-related injuries than of infectious diseases. That's a big transformation. So it comes at a bit of a tipping point, at least in the Western world. When people have gone looking, smarter historians than me have gone looking in India or South Africa or South America, as you mentioned, or China, or even trying to deal with what happened with Aboriginal populations here in Australia, you hit this enormous silence because there's an absence of record keeping. So on the one hand, there may have been a long series of prior diseases that affected those communities, but also we don't know what the death toll in India is. It's gone up and up over the years, but simply nobody was counting, nobody cared. The entire system was so overwhelmed that we don't really know about that. So it's probably true to say in many ways that the flu was better remembered in Western countries because there were more records around it. But also I think, medical events weren't generally seen as the stuff of history, even up until that point, and probably even ultimately pandemics started to be historicized after World War II because we thought we had them beat. We'd had antibiotics, we had mass immunization, we had all sorts of surgical interventions and aseptic surgery and so on. All of these things meant that disease had far less impact on our lives than it had even a generation earlier. Even in the 1920s, if you sent any class in Australia in the 1920s, 30 kids, you would expect one of them would probably die of either scarlet fever or diphtheria. Imagine if we had that sort of statistic today. Even if we had that in the 1970s, we would have been appalled. So in other words, even the idea of big medical events is historicized by the post-war period, I think. So there's a few things in there, but of course, different countries had different trajectories. So does that fully answer your question? It is, yeah. Oh, Nancy, nice to hear from you. So Nancy's question follows on from Hamish's. Local studies based on local sources. And Nancy's at the University of Newcastle, which is where Hunter Living Histories are based. And they are just extraordinary in terms of being a university connected with their community. I really look up to them as an inspiration. Now, Nancy agrees that they're important, but they don't need to be, don't they need to be connected to one another, to state and national contexts? doesn't seeing the bigger picture, constraints and opportunities help people see how their community was part of a whole and where they did go in their own direction. Yeah, look, that's a great question too, Nancy. I guess that's what we tried to do with our research guide for the pandemic project, was we said, yes, please do go to local councils, to your local studies librarian, to the local cemetery, go sniffing around, secondhand shops, go and look at the memorials in your community, read the local newspapers, get a sense of what was happening there, listen to the oral histories, talk to people in the community. Yes, you do need those local sources, but how about looking at state archives or the Australian War Memorial or the National Archives of Australia as well, and see what they've got. And the records that might intersect are these ones. It might be around troop ships, personal interest of mine. It might be around state borders, particularly border towns. Yeah. One of the reasons I did that roadshow to Tenterfield and Albury was to hit those border towns as well. I wanted to know what memories of it they had, as well as going inland to Bathurst and also coastal with Stockton. And that's where we did also encourage a little bit of reading of the historiography as well, because I think it is good, if you can encourage community historians to read a couple of histories about a particular topic, it does make it clearer that this had an impact beyond the region as well. So yeah, this is another point, I guess, coming back out of that Hamish's question earlier, as you said, is he's asking how academic historians or academically trained historians can learn from and work with community historians. The traffic does go in the other direction too. And that, again, like working with archaeologists, it is a conversation that we can promote. And we just need to approach it with that spirit of generosity and sneak it into the conversation sometimes. It's like I gave a talk about a shipwreck down in Wollongong about a month ago. And I called it, "The Captain Was Drunk," because I knew that I'd bring the punters in. And halfway through the talk, I said to them, "You know what I'm doing here, don't you? I'm actually talking to you about maritime infrastructure. But if I'd said this was a talk about maritime infrastructure in 19th century Australia, you wouldn't have come." So I had to lure you in with a story, build up a scenario, and then sneak the infrastructure in. And so there are ways we can do that, I guess, where you bring in that historiography and talk about the bigger picture while telling those local stories. Hamish has responded to Nancy there. Museums, libraries, and archives can play a huge role in gluing multiple different initiatives together. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so I think for this time, so I'd like to invite our Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor, Mike Wilmot, to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a fascinating talk. That theme of forgetting and why is it that this event that was obviously of enormous consequence for so many people and in a very direct way, in their local community, in their family, why it hasn't been the subject of more commemoration. It reminded me of a little bit of my personal family history. My maternal grandmother lived to the age of 102, and 1918-19, she was a little girl, housed as a lot of the families that were, the men that were returning from the Great War. They were waiting for new houses to be built for them, and she lived with her mother and father on the site of what is now the Cambridge University main library, but at that time had been the site of a hospital for servicemen, and it was repurposed in 1918-19 as a place for these families to live. So she was a little girl, and she had a historian came to her to kind of get some of her life history, because obviously, being so aged, she was a source of fascination for some local historians. And anyway, so she was asked about, life in 1918-19 and what she remembered. And she didn't remember anything about the Spanish flu at all. All she could remember was the fact that as a little girl, she used to find ways to get into the backs of the colleges, find where the kitchens were and beg for ice cream off of the off of the kitchen staff. So you can see how this momentous world event didn't make really much of an impression on her at all. So her memory of those years was all about ice cream and finding the quickest way to kind of get into the kitchens. So, but it makes me, I wish she was still alive, because I would love to go back now and ask her if she has any memories of this event at all, because it's incredible. We've lived through a pandemic. I think it would be really fascinating to go 100 years into the future and find out from people in 100 years time, you know, what do they know of the life that we lived through? What kind of stories will they get told? Amazing. So thank you so much for sharing your research with us. And I think it's given us all a lot to think about. So thank you so much on behalf of the university, on behalf of all of my colleagues who have so generously given their time to organise again a wonderful Russel Ward Memorial Lecture. Peter, thank you very much on behalf of the university.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Thanks everyone for joining us online. Thanks everyone for coming.